At just 18, this boy was wanted across more than 3 continents. He had stolen millions of dollars from banks and fooled entire systems hundreds of times. His name is Frank Abagnale Jr. But eventually, he was caught and sent to prison. What happened after that is even stranger than a Hollywood movie. This is the story of Frank Abagnale, the most infamous teenage con man in history. Frank Abagnale Jr. was born in 1948 in New York. He grew up in an affluent, high-class family. His father ran a stationery and printing business and bore the status of millionaire. His mother, who was originally from France, took care of the family. At school, Frank was a regular student. He was not rebellious and not exceptionally talented. He followed rules and stayed out of trouble. Frank was especially close to his father and admired the way he carried himself. As Frank grew older, he picked up subtle lessons from his father. His father knew how to present himself. He dressed neatly and carried himself like someone who belonged. People responded to that. When Frank was about 15 years old, his parents' divorce was finalised. By then, the family had already been fractured for several years. After the divorce, Frank chose to live with his father. He moved in with him in Mount Vernon, New York. His father tried to give him a sense of normalcy and independence. He even bought Frank a Ford, giving him freedom that few teenagers had at that age. That freedom changed Frank. He became reckless and irresponsible, spending money he did not have. During this period, Frank conned his father into giving him around $3,400, which he used largely for personal indulgences, mainly including relationships with women. When his father discovered the truth, he was deeply hurt, but he forgave him. The incident, however, had consequences. In the upcoming year, his father's situation worsened. His business collapsed. He sold properties, lost his livelihood, and eventually took a job as a postal clerk to survive. This troubled Frank deeply. That sense of helplessness turned inward. Frank became increasingly depressed, watching the person he respected most slowly break down. And not long after that, at 16 years old, Frank Abagnale Jr. made a decision that would end his childhood completely. He dropped out of his high school and ran away from home. After leaving home, Frank was determined to become a successful man, and to avoid the mistakes he believed had ruined his father's life. He wanted status, money, and control, and he wanted them quickly. At the time, Frank had just $200 in his bank account. He found a job at a stationery store in New York, earning $60 a week. It barely covered food and rent, let alone the lifestyle he wanted. Frank believed the problem was his age. At 16, he felt he was being dismissed and underpaid simply because he was seen as a boy. So he made a simple decision. Overnight, Frank added 10 years to his age. Frank has heard a lot of people saying he looks 26, as he was 6 foot tall, so he thought, why not? With a slightly older identity, he began navigating the city more easily. Frank was also spending heavily on women and social life. Money was not just about survival anymore, it was about image. That is when he discovered something important. Local stores, hotels, and small businesses would often cash personal checks without proper verification, as long as the amount was small and the customer appeared trustworthy. Frank began writing checks against his own account, slowly exceeding his balance. At first it worked, then it worked too well. As the fraudulent checks piled up, Frank grew anxious. He knew he could not stay in New York much longer. He needed a way out, but he had no clear plan. Then one day, he noticed something that changed everything. He saw a group of Pan Am pilots walking through an airport terminal. They moved with authority. No one questioned them. Doors opened automatically. A thought crossed his mind, almost absurd in its simplicity. What if he was a pilot? Frank began planning carefully. He did not rush. First, he needed information. He called Pan American World Airways and claimed he was a student working on a high school newspaper, requesting an interview with the pilots. The airline cooperated, and Frank learned how pilots spoke, dressed, and identified themselves. Using that information, he acquired a pilot-style uniform and created a fake identification card through a local vendor. To complete it, he bought a Pan Am toy airplane, removed the logo, and attached it to the ID. With the uniform, the confidence, and the paperwork, Frank stepped into his first con role. He never flew aircraft himself. Instead, he used his appearance to gain access. to airport lounges, jump seats, and free travel. As a pilot, he learned that he could cash personal checks at airports with almost no scrutiny. The uniform did the verification for him. Frank travelled constantly, moving from airport to airport, city to city. By the time he was 19, he had passed through dozens of countries, blending into a world built on trust and assumption. The biggest weakness for Frank was woman. As he would say, there is always a woman. For the same reason, once in Miami, he came dangerously close to being exposed. Questions were asked, suspicion rose, but once again Frank slipped away. And by then the line between survival and deception had completely disappeared. After his close escape in Miami, Frank Abagnale Jr. left Florida and headed to Georgia. By now, impersonation was no longer accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and carefully planned. In Georgia, Frank chose a new role, a pediatrician. Using forged documents, he secured a position at Cobb General Hospital under a false name. There, he met Dr. Frank Connor, a senior physician who unknowingly became central to Frank's cover. Frank stayed at the hospital for nearly 11 months. During that time, he was careful. He did not perform surgeries. Instead, he positioned himself as a supervising doctor, overseeing young medical interns who did most of the hands-on work. When questioned, Frank relied on charm and humour. He deflected technical discussions, avoided details, and played the role of a relaxed senior physician. But beneath the act, Frank was constantly aware of the risk. That moment finally arrived when he was asked to treat a child with a broken leg. It was a routine case for a real doctor, but for Frank it was a line he could not cross. For the first time, the consequences were no longer about money or escape. They were about a child's safety. Frank did not wait to be exposed. He resigned quietly and left Georgia on his own terms. After leaving Georgia, Frank moved to Louisiana. In Louisiana, Frank reconnected with someone he had met earlier during his time posing as a pilot. Her name was Brenda Strong, a Pan Am flight attendant. Frank had told Brenda that he was also a law graduate from Harvard, but did not pursue the practice. Brenda introduced Frank to a practicing attorney. The attorney asked to bar counsel at Louisiana and start practice. He forged a Harvard Law School diploma and applied for permission to take the Louisiana bar exam. Frank studied obsessively for weeks. After roughly 8 weeks of preparation, he passed the exam. Frank secured a job at the Louisiana Attorney General's office, working as a legal assistant. But the risk grew quickly. Other lawyers began trying to befriend him. Real alumni wanted details, shared memories Frank did not have. Frank understood the pattern by now. Every role had a lifespan. Before anyone could expose him, he quietly resigned and left Louisiana. After leaving Louisiana, Frank moved west, eventually arriving in Utah. In Utah, Frank claimed a new title, a sociology professor. Using forged credentials, he secured a short-term teaching position at a local college, Brigham Young University. Unlike medicine or law, teaching offered him something crucial: time. There was no immediate test, no hands-on risk, and no urgent verification. Frank prepared obsessively. He stayed one chapter ahead of his students and delivered lectures the next day with confidence. Still, the role did not last long. Before doubts could turn into investigations, Frank left Utah quietly. Once again, he disappeared on his own terms. At this point, Frank stopped thinking small. He understood that forging a small check carried the same punishment as forging a large one, so he escalated his operations. Frank moved from personal checks to corporate and payroll forgery. He settled in Eureka, California briefly, breaking his own rule about staying mobile. Part of it was convenience. Part of it was a woman. During this time, he grew close to a Pan Am stewardess named Rosalie. He confessed his crimes, then immediately feared he had made a mistake. When he sensed she might have spoken to authorities, panic set in. Frank fled Eureka overnight, moving through San Francisco and Las Vegas, already planning larger schemes. Posing as a Pan Am supervisor, Frank recruited 8 young women by promising paid airline promotions. He gave them uniforms, fake IDs, and free flights. Together they looked like a real flight crew, and no one questioned them. Travelling with stewardesses made everything easier. Hotels opened doors, banks lowered guards, forged Pan Am checks were cashed without hesitation. in the US and abroad. But the pressure was growing. Law enforcement was closing in. At airports, Frank began spotting familiar faces, including FBI agent Carl Hanratty. Using the crew as cover, Frank slipped through crowds and escaped across borders. The scams were bigger now, so were the risks, and the chase was nearly over. After years on the run, Frank settled briefly in France. By then, exhaustion and paranoia had caught up with him. On a Sunday morning, a Pan Am stewardess recognised him. She had seen his face before. She reported him. Frank was arrested in France and sent to prison. There was no glamour left. During a later transfer flight under custody, Frank made a desperate move. He escaped from the airplane kitchen, slipping away during transit and vanishing once again. But the run did not last. Soon after, at Montreal airport, Frank was recognised and arrested again. This time, there was no escape. Multiple countries now wanted him, and the chase had reached its end. The con man was finally out of moves, or was he? After his capture in Montreal, Frank was extradited to the United States and sent to prison in Atlanta. He confessed during these years he had cashed fraudulent checks of worth $2.5 million over the years. He was facing decades behind bars. But prison did not quiet Frank's mind. It sharpened it. Locked inside a system he had spent years exploiting from the outside, Frank began studying it the same way he always had, watching routines, memorising procedures, and noticing gaps. Slowly, he built a plan, a careful one. He watched how paperwork moved through the prison. Who signed what? Who questioned documents? And who didn't? He noticed that guards trusted forms more than faces, stamps more than people. So Frank created one. Using materials he managed to obtain inside prison, he forged an official-looking document that stated he was an undercover FBI agent and was needed outside the facility for a court-related transfer. The language was formal, the formatting looked right, and most importantly, it matched what guards expected to see. When the moment came, Frank didn't rush. He walked calmly, holding the papers, answering questions before they were asked. The guards glanced at the document, not at him. Frank managed to walk out of the prison. For a brief moment, it worked. Once again, he was free. But freedom did not last. Frank was quickly captured again. That was when something unexpected happened. Instead of adding more years to his sentence, the Federal Bureau of Investigation made Frank an offer. They had studied his crimes closely. They realised something important. Frank understood fraud better than anyone chasing him. The proposal was simple. He could continue wasting his life in prison, or he could help the FBI stop the very crimes he once committed: check fraud, forgery, and identity deception. For the first time, Frank was offered a role that required no disguise. It was a chance to use his knowledge for something real, and this time he said yes. He began working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, helping agents understand fraud from the inside. For years, Frank trained investigators, banks, and corporations. He showed them how checks were forged, how identities were stolen. He also became a writer. His story was published, read globally, and later adapted into a film that made his name famous. The boy who once believed appearance mattered more than truth finally learned the cost of that belief and how to undo it. And that may be the most unbelievable part of his story.